So today we are here for our Lunch and Learn series, which we have been running all from March through June pretty much every Friday. Took a little pause and are back now with new Lunch and Learns every first and third Friday of the month. And this is our first one on the topic of strategic restructuring with the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started in just a second, but wanted to make sure that everybody knows who we are and what we can offer for you here at the Center for Nonprofit Management. And in particular, wanting to make sure that everyone knows that we're currently holding open office hours with our consultants. So if you've got burning questions, something that you need to run by another human, short of just Googling, we're around and ready to talk. We also are halfway through our Summer of Change virtual seminar series, where we've got discounted programs that are 3 hours each, running pretty much most days of the week for the next couple of weeks still. And we've also got our whole compilation of COVID-19 resources on our website that we've been updating with new information as we go. Wanted to, let's see, a couple upcoming courses just to put on your radar, and these are next up in our Summer of Change series. Cultivating Resilience for You and Your Team During COVID-19 is next Tuesday. Centering Equity, Inclusion, and Race in Our Virtual Spaces is Wednesday. And then a crash course in grant writing and particularly grant searching is on Thursday. Those are all on our website at cnmsocal.org/events. One more little plug is that we're in the process of updating our 2020 sector survey. This is an annual survey that we do that went out in April, but a lot has changed since April. So we would really love it if you would take a few minutes. This is on our website on the homepage. It'll link to a SurveyMonkey. As much information as you're willing to share, entirely confidential, and you'll have the opportunity to enter a raffle for some free seminars with us. Finally, I just wanted to set the tone for our meeting a little bit today. Really glad you could join us. These are friendly, conversational kinds of sessions that we like to do, wind down the week. And just a couple reminders, today is about a learning exchange. Feel free to speak, freely and candidly, but we are recording this session so that we can share it with people who are unable to join. Take care of yourself, mute yourself when you're not talking. Feel free to leave video off. We would love to see your faces, especially during Q&A, but completely understand if you need to run to the bathroom or whatever you need. Obviously, honor everyone's perspectives, speak from your own experience, and try and keep an open mind. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand things over to our CEO, Regina Birdsell.
Well, thanks, Aaron, and good morning, everybody. As Aaron just said, this session is for you, and so we will keep an eye on the chat. What we find is that it's a great place to share resources with colleagues, and that's the whole intention of these Lunch and Learn. So welcome. It's good to see you guys on a Friday in August. We know that you are stressed and busy, and that this hour hopefully will give you some answers to some questions that are on your minds. So with that, one of the things that we know is that people are starting to look at different scenarios for the future. And one option that we wanted you to learn a little bit more about is a program that's been running for many years here in LA that the funders brought together to really focus on nonprofit sustainability. So alliances, partnerships, mergers, and an amazing resource that's been really helpful for organizations. So we're excited to have some experts here to talk to you. And so a couple things. First of all, we wanted to ask a couple of questions to get a sense of if you've thought about this and hear from you a little bit about what's been on your mind so that we can make this session most valuable to you. So Aaron, if you can help me with the first poll question.
Awesome, they're up now.
All right, so if you guys can tell us kind of what's on your minds, are you currently considering a strategic restructure? And then the second question, what incentives make strategic restructuring appealing to you? Kind of what's on your mind, what you're hoping for? You can let us know about those two things and then we'll get started.
Beep, boop, boop, beep, beep, boop, boop. Seeing results popping in here. I'll give everybody another minute or so. I want to make sure we've got as many represented here as we can. I didn't realize these would be asked at the exact same time, but that's good to know. We're slowing down a little bit. I'm going to wrap up the poll and share the results.
So currently considering, and 44% not considering, 33%. Interesting. Currently undergoing, and interesting, 17%, and then searching for a partner. This is great because all of those topics are going to be covered in the remarks coming up. And then the financial challenges being the top reason to be thinking about this for you guys, and then program growth, and then scale and succession. So great. Really helpful to know that. So with all of those issues in mind, plenty of things to talk about, and we're really excited to have Ellah, Ronen from LA in Sync, Carrie Harlow from the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative here in LA, and then Dan George, who has been through this process and thought he would be a good resource for you to help answer questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Ellah, and really looking forward to what we learned today.
Thanks so much, Regina. I see lots of people. Are we putting speaker view? Are we putting the slides on the screen? There we go. All right, great. So my name is Ellah Ronen. I am a senior program officer at the California Community Foundation. And under my purview is an initiative called LA in Sync, but also sustainability. And so we sit as a managing funder of the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative. If we can move to the next slide. Great. So what is the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative? It's an initiative that was launched in 2012 with several funders, CCF, the Weingart Foundation, and the Parsons Foundation. And the idea was, how can we normalize the narrative and the conversation about strategic restructuring in the nonprofit sector? Oftentimes we hear about mergers and acquisitions in the for-profit world, and sometimes they come with big, grandiose, opportunity and leverage and partnership in terms of how we think about them. Sometimes not, but in the nonprofit sector, it's a little bit more of a taboo subject, when really it's potentially just part of the life cycle of what the nonprofit is going through, of a result of the current environment, and a really smart and fiscally responsible thing to be thinking about. So how could we help normalize that in the nonprofit sector, and also help support having these conversations, and even potentially support the overall engagement and integration of this? So currently we have 18 funders, including the ones that I mentioned above, and it's run by what we call our managing funders. So we have contributing funders and managing funders, and those are CCF, Parsons, the Amundsen Foundation, UniHealth, and then again, as I mentioned, the distribution or the disbursement of funds through our other funder partners. What do we mean when we say strategic restructuring? I think it could mean a lot of things. And so how we work is we focus on alliances and networks. Are there coalitions, collaborative movements, collective impact efforts that could benefit from having a more formalized partnership, having made those connections, having some agreed upon MOU or interaction or service alignment? There are shared service arrangements, so co-locating. Why spend two rents or two leases when you can only spend one? Shared staffing across similar areas of expertise or similar service providing staff, back office cooperation, integration, fiscal sponsorship, and then ultimately an even more formalized long-term arrangement, agreement, partnership around joint ventures, creating parent to subsidiary relationships, asset transfers, and complete mergers. And so how do we do this through NSI? we have two stages of funding. One, our first stage is called negotiation grants, and that's the funding of a consultant to help facilitate these exploratory conversations and what could ultimately be agreed upon at the end of that exploratory phase. What is NSI is a national network, but each operates individually, and I think what is so special about our network is that we have a third-party consultant that helps manage this first stage process. And that's important because oftentimes it could be intimidating for a nonprofit to go to a funder and say, hey, we need help. We are thinking about having these conversations. We're looking into what a strategic restructuring might look like, and having Carrie as our third-party consultant who, does a fantastic job of sort of stewarding those relationships, having those conversations, and creating a safe space for nonprofits to come and say that they're in this exploratory phase. Secondly, we then help support with the integration. So once those negotiations and those agreements have been made, then the next step is to actually implement them, and that can often have costs associated with it as well. So we also support the integration phase of those grants for those one-time costs related to that implementation process. So IT integration, rebranding, legal fees, etc., whatever is an agreed upon one-time cost of that integration. And with that, I will pass it on to our NSI managing consultant, Carrie.
And I'm going to unmute myself. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Ellah. So the next, as Ellah mentioned, I managed the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative. My role was created so there would be a neutral party to counsel organizations through those early stages, first conversations around considering their own readiness for this process, identifying partner organizations, and identifying a facilitator, a consultant that can help them facilitate the negotiation. So as you can see here, we have had over 240 organizations here in Los Angeles County go through a strategic restructuring negotiation. So we're well on our way in terms of that aim of normalizing the conversation, as Ellah mentioned. Among those 240 organizations, they were exploring 90 different partnerships, and they run the gamut in terms of the spectrum that you saw there of the different models of collaboration. And we'll give you a couple examples today so that you can kind of wrap your head around like how different they can really look. And you'll see that some are still in progress, and some of them, not all of them end in an agreement, and we'll talk about that as well. So I just want to give you a little bit more of an idea of a sense for the type of organizations engaging in this work. You'll see here it's quite a diverse group of program areas that are represented among those 240 organizations. So you'll see nearly 13% in the arts, 12% in education, 18% healthcare service providers. There were a couple animal welfare organizations that came to us. Big chunk of it is youth and family serving organizations, and human services, which includes things like community development, housing, advocacy, legal aid, a variety of areas. So that just kind of gives you a sense that this is a process that's relevant for lots of different types of organizations.
Hey, Carrie, sorry, are you able to get a little bit closer to your mic or speak up a little more? A couple of people mentioned having trouble hearing you. Thank you.
Too quiet? I'll speak up. Is that better? Okay. So before we get into the examples, the case studies that we have for you and our conversation with Dan today, I just want to cover 3 lessons that we've learned. So one is that strategic restructuring is a strengths-based tool. This is something that we know that organizations are most successful engaging in this when they come to it strategically, not from a moment of financial crisis. We know that the negotiations can take anywhere from 3 to 18 months. So it requires a bit of a runway. And I think we found that it's better for organizations to do that financial scenario planning early on before the cash depletes to the point of insolvency, not only because it gives them time to explore these partnerships, but also because then it makes them a stronger and more attractive partner. So I think this is particularly important principle in the context of 2020, in a post-COVID world where so many organizations are dealing with financial challenges, and we're thinking about how do we continue to make this process an accessible process for organizations as they're considering various scenarios. Number two, readiness is a key predictor of success. So when we talk about readiness, we're thinking about capacity, so leadership time and ability to engage in all of the meetings, the due diligence. Dan will share a little bit about that. Financial viability, so I mentioned that, to see the process through. And then we're talking about mission alignment, we're talking about cultural compatibility, trust among partners, realistic expectations. And while we know that sometimes the process is initially driven by executive directors, we also know that it's critical that there's board engagement. And that's something that is really important, I think, prediction of success. Is the board engaged from the beginning in the conversation? Are they participating in the process? And then lastly, NSI defines outcomes, or defines our success, not in whether or not an organization comes to an agreement with a partner, but really in what they gain from the process itself of negotiating or exploring a partnership. So 100% of organizations that have gone through the process with NSI funding, whether or not it resulted in an agreement, have told us that they got value out of the process itself. Most organizations report that participation in NSI has positively impacted board engagement, internal clarity and strategic direction, ability to think clearly, an increased financial strategy and awareness, of openness to future partnerships, and their external reputation has benefited. So I think that's really a key piece. And one thing that we're thinking a little bit differently about this year is when we talk about sustainability, historically, as both funders and leaders of organizations, I think when we think about sustainability, we've been talking about organizational sustainability. And in today's context, when organizations are facing, as you know, insurmountable financial challenges, the question we're asking ourselves is, if we shift that frame from organizational sustainability to mission sustainability and program preservation, how does that open up new opportunities for restructuring and partnership? And I think that that's something that we're still working on in terms of reframing the conversation for ourselves and for our nonprofit partners. So I invite you to kind of try on that new language and that new framing when you think about sustainability, of trying to distance yourself from the organizational structure sustainability and think more about mission preservation, and how does that open up more possibilities for you. So let's see. I'll give you a quick overview of one case study, and then we're gonna get into our conversation with Dan, which I think is gonna be the real highlight today. But this might be an example that some of you are already familiar with. It's the Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network. They first began in 2012, executive directors of 6 different nonprofits who were working with incarcerated youth started meeting once every 3 months informally as a means to support one another. And the conversation became a formal negotiation with NSI funding in 2015. And then they hired a third-party consultant, Seed Collaborative, who at the time went by Hudson and Holland, if any of you know them. And they worked through a formal negotiation process. The organizations at the table all shared a similar challenge in working with the probation department. They all were hoping to get more buy-in from staff and to provide multidisciplinary arts programming at all LA County detention facilities and youth reentry programs. So they created a formal network. 14 member agencies joined this network. Each organization continued to hold and operate as an independent 501c3, but then they also were members of this formal network, which was I think a fiscally sponsored project initially, and then in 2017 became its own 501c3. And through that, leveraging their collective relationships with the probation department, they were able to achieve greater buy-in with the probation department, They tripled their budget in 3 years. They were far more successful in attracting larger grants together. And they were able to coordinate their programming to reduce redundancy, increase coverage at more remote facilities. They expanded from serving 6 sites to 22 collectively. So I think that is just a taste of, I think, an example of what we're talking about when we're saying that a network could be one of the outcomes, and there could be multiple organizations at the table that each bring different strengths, programmatic strengths, but together you see that they've really benefited. So now I'd like to introduce Dan to share with us his experience with Claire Matrix. And it was a merger among 2 organizations in 2018. And I'm gonna actually close out of my screen share and invite Dan to unmute himself so we can start a conversation. So Dan, maybe I'll ask you to start with just telling us the origin story. How did the organizations start their conversation? And what was the initial incentive for Matrix Institute to come to the table, and likewise for Claire Foundation, from what you know?
Sure. So a little bit of background about both agencies. Claire Foundation's been around for 50 years, and it generally started as a 12-step model in substance use disorder based off of the West Side. So it was pretty much mom and pop's grassroots organization. I'm from the Matrix Institute side. We started about 35 years ago, and I can share the personal, intimate conversations we had that actually led to the merger. So as an organization, we really had 3 separate pillars in which we funded our services. So we did treatment services, which were funded through managed care and government funding. We also had a robust training department. And then we also were involved in research. So for us as an organization, we felt we were pretty diverse for the most part in terms of those funding. As we got into, say, year 28, 29, what we realized was we were pretty stagnant. And all around us in our industry, you started having mergers of different companies that really allowed them to expand the different levels of care they were providing. We specialized in outpatient. So we were pretty specialized in that. We did good services, but we realized we were pretty siloed. So it was just an organic conversation that actually happened with the executive team, with the board, probably 2, maybe 3 years prior to the actual merger. So it was the seed was planted in our heads that we knew at some point we had to expand to be able to sustain as an organization. Probably about 1.5 years before the merger, we actually had several talks with other organizations, and it just so happened that with Claire Foundation, the CEO at the time was someone that was familiar with Matrix, and she used to actually be an employee. So she was there right when Matrix started. So there was that natural synergy that kind of occurred. Their board at the same time was looking to merge with the company. So it was just a natural. It wasn't necessarily based off of financial needs. It just seemed like it was the right fit. So in terms of the timeline, and Carrie, when you and I were talking the other day, I just realized how much of a blur the past 3 years of both boards were on the same page, and then we went into a mutual non-disclosure agreement.
I think we're losing you a little bit, Dan.
So at that point, and I believe it was at that point, we engaged NSI. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I'm going to stop your video, though. I think it might improve your audio a little bit. It was doing that speed up, slow down thing a little bit. So maybe just restate your last sentence or 2 you were just saying.
Sure. It probably improved the looks too if you fade me out. Yeah. So there's a natural synergy between both organizations in the sense of their boards were both looking to partner with other agencies. And at that point in time, we weren't quite sure what that would look like, if it was an acquisition, if it was going to be a merger, if it was going to be a partnership, but we just knew we wanted to explore it. So we signed a mutual non-disclosure agreement and we initiated the due diligence process. So the pre-merger due diligence process, we were each assigned a law firm, right? So we had independent consultants to help us on the due diligence. So we did legal due diligence and financial. So this is at the point that we were able to see the other party's records. Internally, we could have discussions, any concerns, any benefits that we recognized in that were discussed. And through that process, it seemed like there was really, it kind of reinforced the direction we wanted to go. So then at that point, we actually, our consulting group, I believe was La Piana, which was a consulting group through NSI. So they helped navigate, because for everyone in the board, everyone on the executive team from both organizations, this was a new process for us. So, and I'll speak for me personally, I was trying to anticipate, what would a merger look like? And by the way, it's not, if it's your first time, it's probably not what you envision. There's a lot of variables to it, and there's a lot of things that come up that you didn't anticipate. My recommendation is to try to anticipate everything, but you're probably going to encounter things that weren't on your radar. So then, of course, we went through that process and we had a target date of when we were going to merge. Finalizing it and trying to work it out, it got extended a little bit. We officially merged April 2nd, 2018. And surprise, the process isn't done at that point, because then you have the post-merger phase. So we actually, we contracted with another consulting group that would specialize in how we're going to restructure, the new foreign agency. And with that, there's a lot of challenges, as you might expect. There's cultural differences in terms of the organizations. I will say this is something that I should mention. In doing our due diligence and related to the culture, one of the big aspects that we did have to engage in prior to the merger was Claire Foundation was based off of 12-step social model. So a lot of the therapies and the therapeutic approach was based off of the social model. For Matrix Institute, we have an evidence-based practice. We leaned on research and we leaned on science-backed services. And one of those services was medication-assisted treatment. And that was a bit, at the beginning, that was a bit of, quote, controversy coming from the other side, because it was new. It was just new, and it wasn't necessarily within the grain of the board's train of thought. So prior to the merger, there was some education in both directions, where we would do presentations to all board members. We would talk about the benefits of the services we provide, and it was really an all-inclusive type of approach to make sure that everyone was comfortable, so that when we do speak about a merged mission statement, we could all speak comfortably about that. So at the time of the merger, another important thing to mention is Claire Foundation had about 70 FTEs, and they probably had an operating budget of about 10 million. And then Matrix Institute was smaller, and we had an operating budget of 4 to 5 million, and we had about 40 to 45 FTEs. So when we merged, we had combined about 125 FTEs. I will say since then, so in the last 2.5 years, as we're in the post-merger phase, we're also in the expansion phase. So currently we're at about 180 FTEs, and our operating budget has expanded from 12 to 13 million up to 20 million. So you got a lot of variables going on in the sense of the post-merger issues that you try to deal with, of just combining and merging two agencies, accompanied by the fact that we're also expanding and we're increasing our operating budget. So then after the post-merger, we had a consulting group for about 4 to 5 months, and then we actually had another consulting group come in for our rebranding, because this was the important thing. It was at that point, how are we going to market ourselves? We did the name change. So about 6 to 7 months after we merged, we became Clear Matrix. And what went into that was we would go out to our stakeholders. We would have surveys, focus groups. We wanted to know what the community thought of each respective organization, and how we can use some of those assets in terms of how we market ourselves once we merge. So that was a whole process in and of itself as well. And then fast forward, we've expanded, and now 2.5 years later, here we are. So there's still challenges that are associated with this, but we're at a point where I feel like we're gaining our new identity, and I think that's always going to be a work in progress moving forward. So I've learned that I envision this going to be 5, 6, 7 year process. So.
Dan, I was hoping I could ask a couple questions that I know that I've gotten about NSI, and then Carrie, you're the expert on all this, but I was curious when you were talking about things that you didn't anticipate. Questions that I always get about this topic are related to how did you get started? Was it a conversation between 2 EDs, 2 boards? And then how did you, I know people have asked me about how the staffs integrate. That seems like a big HR challenge for a while. And then how did you talk to donors? That there's some fear that some of the funding might be wiggly for a while. And then there's the tech and all. So you were kind of talking about some of the process that was tactical, and also it sounds like some of the process that was almost a more emotional and sort of strategy. So I was curious what you anticipated and then what was surprising in both of those pockets.
Yeah, so I'll speak for myself. And again, so I was on the operations side of Matrix. So the first point that you mentioned, which is important too, one of the benefits of us merging is oftentimes when companies merge, there's a huge slashing of staff, and a lot of staff are let go based off of redundancies. One of the benefits for us was, as I mentioned, one agency had 75 and we had 40 to 45. There were only 5 positions that were actually reduced. So there was a lack of redundancy. From the Claire side, they left an operations position open. So I would transition into that. So we were able to address that issue. One of the things that Carrie and I talked about the other day, which was important, was in regards to the staff, was when do we communicate that we're actually moving forward with this to the staff? Because the discussions that we had was, if you start to tell people too early, people start to get worried and anxious. And then that's care of. The flip side is word gets out. People start asking questions, why are there board meetings being held in this office on off days or whatever? And the last thing you want to be caught in is being behind the message, and then have people start talking and there's a perceived lack of transparency, right, from the staff if you're not discussing these things. So in regards to that, we mentioned it to the senior teams in each organization, probably a couple months, 3 months before the merger. And then about 2 months, we started massaging it into the conversations with the staff. So we would talk about partnerships. We would talk about, the need that we have to work with other organizations. So that was from the staffing standpoint. In terms of when we were in the pre-merger discussions and what things we were anticipating and what things we weren't anticipating, I'll speak specifically. I underestimated, I guess, the amount of work that goes into the nuts and bolts of things. And as an example, once we merged, every single contract that Matrix had, because the surviving entity was Claire Foundation, we had to do reassignments. So as a treatment organization, each clinic may have 5 different governing bodies, and you have to submit reassignments to now be Claire Foundation for those. Every single contract we had to do that. And when you're working with different governing agencies. Sometimes, it's not as swift as possible. So we had that whole process. And then 6 months later, when we merged and submitted to the Secretary of State, the new agency, new entity is Claire Matrix, we had to reassign all of those contracts yet again. And then now from the Claire side, had to reassign all those contracts. So I say that to say, like, just the nuts and bolts of all the things that I probably in the pre-merger stage said, oh, we need to reassign things, right? And you don't realize that what extent that means, right? So that was one of those things that was kind of unexpected for me. Yeah.
Dan, to that point, I mean, obviously there's lots of ways of going about this, and we've seen other models as well, like a parent subsidiary structure or ways of navigating depending on what your contracts are as an organization and what your limitations are. But we often see that these partnerships are created sort of in stages because of that. So like there's like an initial stage where there's an MOU and they're sort of practicing working together closely, aligning programming, but the contracts have not yet been combined officially. And that happens, sometimes years down the road. So, I mean, I think there's ways of kind of piecing out into chapters that are less daunting for an organization. And it really is about sort of like what you decide in your negotiation works for you as an organization.
Right. Thank you.
Carrie, I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, because, one option is a merger, but you also mentioned there are other alternatives that are kind of a toe in the water almost. And, one of the things that people have told us is that it was a great chance to learn from each other, and it kind of expand the reach first, and then some early stage partnerships. So
that's why we don't encourage organizations to necessarily come to the negotiation table with sort of a pre-existing idea of what the agreement will be. I mean, sometimes they have a sense, and sometimes they're quite confident about what it will be, but we don't require it. And I think, it truly is an exploration, and you have a skilled facilitator who's been through many negotiations, and so they can kind of provide a menu, right, of all the different models, and you can kind of try them on for fit and see what ends up working in this particular circumstance. So I think, part of our job as an initiative is to address the misconception that we're only talking about mergers, right? When really it's a whole spectrum, like that chart that Ellah was showing. I think that's really key, that this is a process and you're designing your own model for collaboration based on the needs of the parties at the table.
Yeah,
feel free to
Regina,
post your questions. Sorry, Dan. I was just going to mention, feel free to post your questions in the chat, or you're also welcome to raise your hand or unmute yourself. And would love to hear from people who identified in the poll that, if you're currently considering or if you're currently undergoing the process, just whatever you're comfortable sharing about what that process has been like, and if there are any questions for the team on kind of where you are in that process now. But please go ahead, Dan, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I forgot with Regina's question. One of the things you had asked about was I associate with community engagement and stakeholder engagement about donors and the perception of what stakeholders and donors have of us. That was one of the other things was prior to the merger, Claire Foundation had a robust donor base. So they had experience in engaging different organizations and different stakeholders. So they specialize in that. From the Matrix side, our donor base was probably $200 a year from PayPal, right? So we really didn't have anything. So that was one of the things in the merger that we anticipated was a good thing, was that we can leverage that and we can kind of learn from a merged entity of having an established infrastructure on that. So when we did the community engagement, there was a perception at the beginning that Matrix Institute serviced managed care, white collar individuals, when that wasn't necessarily a reality. And then the Claire side kind of came grassroots by servicing the community, passing out meals to the homeless. And so so there was this different perception, and there was, again, in terms of messaging and massage and that no, both agencies really specialize in providing services to the community of those in need, regardless of their funding ability. And but that was an obstacle, but it was something that we were able to engage with them and kind of course correct in terms of the messaging.
Dan, you bring up a really good point, and this goes back to what I was thinking earlier about in terms of compatibility and how you define that. And there's so many ways you can look at it, right? So in this case, I mean, there's compatibility in terms of leadership having a pre-existing relationship and some trust, but also in terms of like sort of your revenue streams being compatible, like one having access to insurance, billing insurance and various models of income. And then when we talk to organizations about identifying a partner, I mean, I can't remember in the poll how many of you were maybe thinking about identifying a partner. So like you're really at the beginning stages of that thought process, and you can think about it so many ways. You can think about what organization is serving the same population as you, maybe geographically or demographically, but providing complementary services, different services. And that together you would be whole in that way. Or maybe you're providing redundant services, but to different communities. And so you can also think about that from a financial perspective, like how are your revenue streams complementary? Does one have a really strong and active board that's fundraising? Does another have a lot of earned income? So when you're thinking about identifying a partner, it's not always, the same model in terms of what you're looking for. It's kind of identifying what your strengths are and maybe what are the other pieces of that puzzle that you'd be looking for. And sometimes it's not a single partner that can complete that puzzle. Maybe it's a few different partners, and that's why we see these networks be created, because sometimes it's more than just two partners at the table.
Carrie, can you talk a little bit about why with NSI I guess we require that partners come in and we don't actually do that matching process? Yes,
I think that's a really important principle the funders kind of hold dear, is that they do not want to be prescriptive about matchmaking. The studies show that that is not successful, and nobody here would be surprised to know that, right? Like, you can't force a partnership. There's so much about trust and cultural compatibility that plays into whether or not it will be successful. And so it does to some degree have to happen organically, to Elah's point. And so we do ask that you identify that partner before requesting funding for the negotiation. We're not gonna hand you a partner because it probably won't work. You need to be able to kind of test that with a few preliminary conversations. And as Dan mentioned, in the case of Claire Matrix, one of the CEOs had, I think, been an intern with Matrix like 30 years prior. So there was like that history of trust and understanding among the organizations to some degree, even though they did have some like issues to work out in terms of like treatment philosophies among the boards. I think, having at least some of that existing cross-pollination really helps to get the conversation started initially.
Great.
Got some good questions coming in the chat here. Wanted to get to Jennifer's that she just posted here, and Dan, curious what you would say, but asking, did the foundation take the fiscal management lead and Matrix provide the program services? I'm just trying to understand a bit more in detail what the merger consisted of.
Sure. And so one of the more important synergy pieces that I didn't mention was in terms of the levels of care, it was almost a perfect match in the sense that, as I mentioned, Matrix Institute, we provided outpatient. So we had 4 clinics, they were all outpatient based. So we had the experience specifically with outpatient, as well as having an opioid treatment program, training department, and research. Claire specialized in doing residential care, sober living, detox, and they had just started outpatient. So when we actually merged the providing services, behavioral health, substance use, and mental health services, we're now able to provide the full continuum of care. So there's really, people say there's no wrong door in terms of trying to go to any specific clinic. we really are able to provide a robust level of services. So yes, they managed to, in terms of the question, they had Claire had the larger infrastructure, and they were the surviving entity. So a lot of our fiscal policies, not clinical, but fiscal and operational policies were pretty much absorbed on the Claire side. But in terms of the actual clinical services, both agencies continued as now a merged agency, providing all levels of care of the clinical services.
Hi, this is Leslie Robin. I'm actually with the Center for Nonprofit Management. We get people calling us when the ED is about to leave and they say, maybe this is a time to think about a new model. So you mentioned the 3 to 18 months. How does that work with it? And is this generally a good time, or is it, what would your sense be for that?
Sorry, if I just want to make sure I understand the question in terms of like how succession planning can sometimes be
A lot of times the organization, the boards will come to us and a board chair will say, you know what, our ED's retiring or leaving, and now we want to think about other models. We want to merge or want to be merged, or we want to think about something else at that time when they're at that point. That's generally a time we get a lot of those questions.
Very common time to start thinking about strategic restructuring. I would say, I actually don't have a percentage, but maybe 30% of the negotiations have some sort of executive transition prompting the conversation, or anticipated executive transition. I would say oftentimes then maybe retiring founder or longtime leader will go to their board, say, I'm looking to leave within the year. And then they start thinking about, do we want to identify a successor? And oftentimes they identify the ideal successor as someone leading a peer organization. And so this is why the conversation oftentimes happens, is that that peer, is not ready to leave. They still feel like they have work to be done at their current role. But then they can start identifying how there's that compatibility among the two organizations. And so, Hillsides and Bienvenidos is a great example of that here in LA. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that story, but a longtime leader was looking to plan a succession, and they, I think, spoke with 9 different potential partners in the field before identifying Hillsides as the right fit to get to a negotiation. And so, a lot of times it's just, taking your peers out for a coffee and getting a sense for where they are in their organizational life cycle, and where they see some holes that they would like to fit with partnerships, and seeing if those puzzle pieces fit together. And then oftentimes it gets taken to the board level, right? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
And you had another question earlier too that I thought was good, Leslie, that Dan, you alluded to with sort of when to inform the staff, but I'm curious about kind of the role of the board versus the staff during this process. Who's brought in when, and how do, aside from the when are they told, when are they invited into this process to become a part, and how do you manage all of those moving pieces as they keep adding up, I would imagine?
Dan, do you want to speak to your experience of how the board played a role in this process? The board?
Yeah, so I'll, again, since I have the actual shared experience of the Matrix side, I'll speak for the Matrix side. So the board was actively involved, and it kind of almost started, Carrie, as you were describing it, where it was these very informal meetings of where I believe the CEO was meeting with our senior board president, right? And they had coffee, and it was part of these discussions. So the board played a huge role. The board was the driver from our side as well as Claire's side. And the dynamic of Matrix, because we were so small, was the board was pretty intimate with the executive team, right? So a lot of the decisions were made jointly. There was complete transparency throughout in terms of the relationships. So just by that nature, the executive team was involved from the beginning. Some of the challenges when we talk about staff, like talking about frontline staff and senior staff, one of the unique challenges on this, and it's unique experience was when we talked about some of the staff being let go during, after the merger. Most of those actually were the executive team in terms of redundancy, right? So what was interesting was you have a finish line of this merger, right? And then you have key participants in that to drive it to that, with the understanding that once they hit that finish line, it's a finish line, right? But what was unique for us was we had people who were at the point of retiring, right? So it's kind of like what you were describing too, was it was almost like a warm handoff in terms of this is where we're going to go to. But yeah, and then Aaron, one of the other things, it's not necessarily specific to this, but another interesting dynamic when we talk about staff and we talk about culture is once we merged and then fast forward to say 6 months, you really had within our agency 3 distinct cultures that existed. You had from one agency, you had, quote, the Claire staff, right? Who are used to, this is the way we used to do protocols and policies. You had the Matrix staff that had that, their unique perception and experience. And then once we merged, as you start hiring people, you have a third culture of people who are being onboarded who don't have any of that previous experience. So they're kind of generating their own culture too. So that was like something that was pretty unique that to see how that plays out. And, you still sometimes have that, people, if they've been with either of the companies for 10, 15 years, that's their experience and they often draw to that. So what's unique is that, we are one new agency and we just have to drive that forward.
Awesome, thank you.
I would say Dan's example is very typical in terms of board involvement. We often see that both organizations or all the organizations participating in a negotiation will identify sort of a task force to participate in the negotiation on behalf of the organization, and it will have members of the board, it will have the executive, and it will have some senior leadership staff that will attend different meetings depending on the topic that will be discussed at that meeting. So it can kind of shift from meeting to meeting who's there depending on what they're going to discuss. But we do hear very often in reflection that organizations really struggled with the decision of when to bring the whole staff into the conversation because of that, what Dan was talking about, worrying about creating fear and being able to address it when you're really early on in the process. But wanting to also bring them in early enough that you can get their buy-in for that change management piece that happens during integration. So it can be kind of a juggle.
Yeah.
Was going to just ask if you could follow up on that a little bit. Jennifer mentioned that, how do you manage that issue of the 3 cultures, that she's experiencing that right now? I'm so curious, if that's still around a bit, but, what are methods that you found successful of dealing with that problem?
Yeah, so we have culture committee meetings, right? So we have representatives from each of our locations, and they're open. So we invite people, other staff members to go, and the goal of that is for those individuals to kind of be the torchbearer to bring back, whatever the culture is that we're trying to, shape. So we have a couple of, it's difficult. I'll say that it's challenging at times in the sense of what I was describing of you can't erase past experiences. But we're at a point now that with the size of our company, the vast majority of people are in that third culture piece that have been onboarded post, right? So it's time. It takes a lot. It just takes time. And you get new grants, you get new projects coming in that don't have a history to it. So it's a new course for everyone to kind of participate in. I think a big key piece is to get ownership of the staff. So you have to involve them and you have to kind of bring them along and not necessarily dictate to people what they have to do and what they should do. it's always important to get the buy-in. So yeah, I don't know if, it's a challenge, but that's what we try to do, is we try to bring people together.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Curious if there are any final questions. Yeah.
Never mind. It's okay.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, any final questions? Want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're just about at an hour. But if anyone's got any last burning things to get answered here, Regina, anything to close us out with?
I just wanted to mention that this couldn't be more timely. Everything that we're hearing from organizations as they're looking at the months and years ahead is, what are the scenarios we should be considering? And so we will be sending to all of you some information that Carrie's made available, so that hopefully get a little bit more information about what NSI is all about, and then how to check it out. But the thing that I think we all are trying to really focus on is that there's no wrong answer right now, right? That everyone's improvising in this current environment. It's going to be a while, and that as you're really focused on how to meet the needs of the communities that are just exploding, this is an option that what really NSI changed was the conversation and the tone, right? That it wasn't about doing anything wrong. It was really about an opportunity. And I think that's really exciting. So I'm so glad that you guys could be part of this right now. We're sure saying that people are struggling with what their options are. And so we'll be back in 2 weeks for our next Lunch and Learn. And we'll be sharing with all of you what we've learned through our most recent sector snapshot. We want you to know you're not alone in all of this. And we're here as a resource, but thought it would be helpful to share with you what your colleagues are saying about how they're doing and what's working and what isn't. And so we'll be back in 2 weeks. And thank you guys, Carrie and Ellah and Dan, for being candid about what this program is all about, and being open to share some of the myths and some of the opportunities. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having
Regina,
us.
can I just say one last thing?
Absolutely.
I felt as though I mentioned a lot of challenges. So I just want to leave it on a good note that we're in a good place in terms of we're able to provide a robust level of services. And to me, that's the key thing. So there's challenges on the way, but the end goal is it's a good experience. So I didn't want to cloud that by just naming the challenges. So yes, so thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dan. That's a nice way to end. And thank you guys for spending your lunchtime with us today.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. As Regina mentioned, we'll be following up with some of those materials from NSI and an invite to our next Lunch and Learn 2 weeks from today on the Sector Snapshot. Hope everyone has a good rest of their Friday and healthy and safe weekends. Bye.
Bye.